Hello, comrades, and welcome to the Revolution Report. My name's Donald Corder, the editor-in-chief of the Revolution Report, and today we're having a live stream about Russia, Africa, and the emergence of the multipolar world. And to talk about this today, we've got my personal friend, personal comrade, and a great intellectual, Alexander McKay from the Marx Engels Institute. So we're going to be using this video to talk a bit about those topics. First of all, Alex, thanks a lot for coming on the Revolution Report. I appreciate it. Always a pleasure talking to you. And also, the audience should definitely check out our previous podcast that we did on your show, actually, right? It was about Georgia, correct? When the protests were going on.
Yes, we were discussing color revolutions and how the West has utilized them over the years. And now the collective West is facing a series of, shall we say, more genuine movements that could challenge it, especially in what we're going to be talking about today with regard to Africa.
Yeah. So, let's get right on to it because, like you said, Africa is a very similar or very interconnected with that idea of color revolutions and the West trying to intervene in, the affairs of sovereign nations all around the world. I guess where we can start probably is the Russia-Africa Forum, because, I went there and that was kind of the major event that happened recently that really kind of put this Russia-Africa cooperation into the forefront of the news and what people are talking about and everything. And I'd like to hear what you thought about it, because I went there. I thought it was really crazy how many countries were represented there, how much people were excited to be there from the African continent. And actually, a funny thing is, obviously, most of our viewers know that I work at Russia Today as my full-time day job. And obviously, we do work in English, so it's not often that I'm in Russia and someone comes up to me and they're like, "Oh, hey, I saw you on TV." Even in the United States, really, I've never even gotten that. But so many people from Africa, because people speak English all over the place in Africa because of the, former colonial history of Britain. And tons of people came up to me saying they saw me on Russia Today. So it just goes to show that the African continent right now is really interested in anti-imperialist politics in general and what Russia has to say. And that was evidenced by the fact that tons of documents in terms of cooperation between the African continent and Russia were signed at this forum. The fact that so many people showed up. 54 countries were invited and 49 representatives from 49 different countries showed up. So, and even Vladimir Putin made an appearance. So that was, I think it was a really interesting and impactful event. But what did you hear about it, Alex? And how did people in the UK really receive it? Or was it even covered in the media?
Well, the Financial Times declared it a failure and declared that only 17 countries actually went. But that's what you would come to expect from ruling class newspapers now. They've tried to ignore it, tried to play it off, tried to say it was a failure, but then of course you dig into the article and you find out that, as you said, 49 governments were represented there, even governments that have had a long-standing relationship, or should we say somewhat dubious relationship with the US imperialists, such as Sisi was there from Egypt, shaking hands with Putin. And this will have followed on from what seems to be a very intense burst of activity from the US, trying to dissuade, shall we say, nations from attending. But I think it speaks to the fact that everybody can see the dynamics in the world shifting, and that the power of US imperialism is slowly draining away, which is why you've even got presidents who've had, again, like relationships with the West in the past, now going over almost wholly to arrangements with Russia, arrangements with China. So it was Museveni from Uganda made an interesting speech about development in Africa. And you got a lot of reflection also on like the Soviet legacy in the African nations. Putin and Lavrov made statements about how downscaling the diplomatic presence in the African nations in the 90s was a mistake. And you got the Russian government leaning more into the Soviet legacy, which it's been doing progressively more and more, it seems, as time has gone on. and particularly with regard to the legacy in Africa, which is, of course, one which many of the leaders present and the great masses in the African nations will remember themselves, because the Soviet Union, of course, aided many liberation struggles, aided the people in places like Egypt, of course, to hold on against imperialism in the 1950s and 1960s, helped the liberation movements, even in the later period of the Soviet Union, in places like Burkina Faso, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. So the legacy and the memory there is something which is going to be, it turns out to have been very, very important. And of course, with the Russians forgiving, I believe it was $20 billion worth of debt that was still being incurred by the African nations, by announcing that they were willing to provide food aid at very low prices or at no price at all, you can see why the African nations would favor engagement with Russia and, of course, China as well over the Western imperialist countries, because I'm sure we can get more into the details of this, but just in brief, where you've got like the Russians and the Chinese, you've got the Russian security assistance to places like the Central African Republic, to Burkina Faso and to Mali, which, according to most indications, shows a greater deal of success at dealing with the ongoing jihadist problem that these countries have than all the years of military forces being there from the US and Europe. Now, we can get into why that is later, but it speaks volumes as to the fact that the Russian forces have had more success with regard to that you can see that this is helping to bring the Russian state a good deal of popularity. And of course, Putin being personally seen by many in the African nations as being a man who's standing up to the US is gaining him a lot of popularity. And you look at the statements made by Museveni and others about economic development in Africa, and if you look at like how that's gone over the past 30 or so years, the unrestricted rampaging of US imperialism and its European acolytes in holding down the development of the African nations, in making sure that they can't develop industrially or agriculturally in a positive direction. And you can see that why so many African nations would think, well, now that the US is fading, now is the time to get out and get ourselves a better arrangement. Even with a post-Soviet Russian Federation is offering far more than the Western Europeans do, which is just all about holding the African nations in a pattern of what Kwame Nkrumah, the first leader of Ghana, famously identified as neocolonialism: deliberate underdevelopment, draining away of resources, leaving these countries in perpetual debt traps. And it's nice that they want to leave all that behind now.
Yeah, I have to agree, especially what you said about Russia contributing to the curbing of like jihadi terrorism in Africa, because also one of the countries represented at the Russia-Africa Forum was Uganda. And I remember when the Ugandan foreign minister actually came to Moscow, and he talked about how Uganda has become basically an island of stability in Africa because of the sort of defense contracts and defense cooperation that it's been doing with the Russian Federation, while countries all around it are dealing with really serious problems connected to jihadi terrorism. And I think the expansion of Russian defense cooperation in Africa is only going to make that place more stable. And that's one of the things that the Eritrean president told me, actually, when I did an interview with him. You guys can check it out on our channel if you want. It's the last video we uploaded, the Eritrean president, and he's very pro-Russian also. His region obviously is very complicated, because for viewers who don't know what Eritrea is or its history, it's a really complicated thing. I mean, the current president was the leader of the independence movement, because they were part of Ethiopia for a long time, and then they became independent, and then they fought against Ethiopia, and then the West started funding some rebels in Ethiopia, and the Eritrean government ended up siding with the Ethiopian government to fight these rebels. So it's a really complicated and unfortunately very bloody history, but it's finally starting to stabilize since last year, when the war against the Tigray rebels supported by the West has finally came to an end, and that's why Russia, really is moving to further cooperate in terms of defense with governments in the area right now to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen again. But and we're also seeing, we can also talk about Wagner, because of the fact that. I guess this is a good bridge onto Niger that we wanted to talk about. The fact that the government there, well, the coup d'état, the military junta, whatever you want to call it, that they've called on Wagner for help because the West and the ECOWAS, basically pro-Western economic bloc led by Nigeria, is threatening military intervention. If the junta doesn't step down today, so that's a really newsworthy thing we can talk about, because obviously everyone's talking about how the previous president was like democratically elected and the military overthrew him, but it's a little more complicated than that because this military junta that's come to power is very anti-colonial and very pro independence, sovereignty, and they're supported by Burkina Faso and Mali, which have actually threatened to come in on the military junta's side if the West intervenes or if the ECOWAS economic bloc intervenes. So it could really be a nasty situation. What do you think about that?
Well, I think what's going on there is it's evidence of a lot of even the people in Niger and places like that were regarded as like solid allies of the West. So like the officers who have led the coup and have set up the new, well, they officially call it National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, or the junta, whatever you want to call it, that a lot of them went through Western training programs over the last 15 to 20 years. There's pictures of Chiani, the current president, at the Indy 500 last year, taking selfies, and people are baffled as to, well, why could this guy who was trained by us turn on us? And of course, that shows a horrific ignorance of history, because you see a lot of military officers who've been through British or French or later American training programs become radicalized by their experiences and by the changing nature of the world and the shifting struggles in the world, and turn on the people who trained them. I mean, this is why ultimately the British had to quit India, because the Indian army that they trained and armed had turned on them. So this is an very interesting development, and it speaks to us about the nature of the independence that was granted, not just to the French colonies, but to all the colonies in Africa after the 1950s, when you got the realization dawning in Paris and London that the formal colonialism was going to have to go, that they couldn't afford to keep it in place anymore, that the population was going to resist too much and endanger their investments. So then you get the period of, as I said before, neocolonialism setting in, where you have independence to an extent. But when you look at a place like Niger, particularly, this was one of de Gaulle's insistences when the French were leaving Africa, which is that they, of course, had to join the CFA franc area, which is this collective currency that the French put in place after 1945 that enables, of course, easy exports of raw resources from the colonized nations into France, and, of course, easy exports back again of French manufactured goods. But it gives you a huge disadvantage if you want to export your raw materials anywhere else. And so this was one of de Gaulle's insistences when they so supposedly voluntarily decolonized, was that France would continue to a large extent, control these nations' currencies. And Niger is one of these nations. It's the reason why huge amounts of the gold reserves of places like Niger and Mali are held in the Bank of France. And of course, why large areas of monetary policy are actually controlled from ultimately Brussels through the European Central Bank, because of course CFA franc area is linked to the euro. And you see then, well, what happens with the huge amount of resources that places like Niger have when it comes to uranium mining or gold mining in both in Niger and Mali, that a lot of that gets taken straight to France and other European nations too. And then you see the statistics with regard to the quality of life of the population, the great masses of a place like Niger, where you have a gigantic amount of illiteracy, where a huge amount of the population for a country that produces all this energy in the form of uranium for Europe isn't even hooked up to the electricity grid, where as I said, the life expectancy is around about 50 or so, where you have a massive amount of illiteracy. And you can see what 60 years of independence and constant coups sponsored by French imperialism, with US imperialism standing behind them, have done for places like this. So it's not a surprise that you get in Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, and now Niger, people inspired, at least partially, by the legacy of like radical free officers movements of the past, including the late, great Thomas Sankara, who have started to step forward and seeing the US's holds in Ukraine and places like that start to be loosened, have stepped forward to try and make another push to shove the French and ultimately US influence out of their countries. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that the countries like Niger, it's dismissed in academia, in Western academia, they say that, oh, well, they've got a resource trap, which means that the rest of the economy doesn't develop because they've got all these resources that market incentives cause them to sell and rely on selling these raw resources to external customers in Europe or the United States. But of course, it's not the fact of having the resources that gives them that problem. It's the fact that the French and ultimately the United States imperialists have continued to control the economy of these countries since independence, and have kept them quite deliberately in a state of underdevelopment. And so I'm sure that you would have seen this growing up in the States. I certainly saw it growing up in like the 90s in Britain. All these charity appeals about, well, what can we do to help the African nations? Why are they so poor? Why can't they do this, that, or the other? And of course, what's never mentioned is the fact that these nations are kept poor deliberately. We keep them, the imperialist nations do, as sites of cheap extraction of raw resources. And this is done by the British, it's done by the French, it's done by the EU collectively when it comes to nations like Kenya, where they don't even allow them to actually process the coffee beans they grow in that country. They've got to send them just straight to Europe to have the product finished. And this, again, goes back to something that Yoweri Museveni of Uganda was saying, which is that the Europeans and the Americans don't want the African nations to be able to do like value-added production, to actually create commodities. They're allowed to produce resources and send them to Europe or send them to the United States, and that's it. And so what he was saying, which is completely legitimate, is that, well, we want to actually manufacture commodities in these countries. We want to actually have trade deals where we not just grow these things, but we are able to turn them into actual marketable commodities and sell them ourselves, which, of course, if that's done, then that's a big kick in the pants for all of the European countries and the US, because suddenly the African nations can start to develop their own industrial bases. They get to move their economy away from just being mono economies, which are designed around just exporting like one or two commodities. And so the whole system of, to use Nkrumah's phrase again, neocolonialism starts to shake. And that's why they're so desperate to squash this event in Niger. It's why they've got their bagman in Nigeria to threaten military intervention. But of course, this is very risky, because if ECOWAS, it's essentially a puppet organization of the British and the French, do stage military intervention, there's no guarantee that they're going to be able to keep control in their own countries. We can already see the control of the Senegalese government is rather shaky. There's a working class revolt there. There's been huge class struggles in Nigeria over the last decade. It's got a gigantic and very young proletariat. It has huge potential in terms of if there was some kind of revolutionary event there that overturned the oligarchic comprador regime that exists there, which incidentally, according to a very interesting report done by the Grey Zone today, the president of Nigeria, Bola Tinubu, was suspected of profiting from drug dealing during his time in the United States, and has been a sort of lifelong bagman for US imperialism. This isn't necessarily a popular guy. So if they try a military intervention on behalf of the colonial powers, then that risks destabilizing all these comprador regimes. So we can see the hold of imperialism starting to shake. They're obliged to try and maintain their hold on places like Niger. They have to take more risks. They have to push their compradors into risking their own rule to try and maintain the hold over Niger, and that could cause a new wave of revolutionary upsurges in West Africa. So these are really, to draw on the Chinese phrase, interesting times that we're living in. We're seeing the last hold of colonialism being shaken, and let's hope it's that the African nations can shake free from it, because again, this is a continent with gigantic potential, and one which has been denied the reaching of that potential in often quite brutal ways by imperialism since nominal independence was granted.
Well, yeah, I agree that it does have tremendous potential, and Vladimir Putin even said at the Russia-Africa summit that if Africa is to go down the road of multipolarity, which is it's looking like in general it is, I mean, the continent itself could become one of the greatest economic and geopolitical powers of the next century, or at the end of this one. But I also just want to also agree with you about the fact that when people ask why is Africa poor, it's obviously because the West is keeping it systemically poor. I recently just watched the movie Blood Diamond that came out earlier in the I think it was in the 2000s, and I always thought it kind of gave a good understanding of how Western companies specifically exploited conflicts for diamond extraction in West Africa. But the takeaway from the end of the movie is like, okay, then this one African guy was taken to a room and got to speak to a bunch of representatives from Western Europe, and they signed a document that said that they weren't going to do this anymore, but the document did absolutely nothing. Like, and it was like hailed in the film as a victory. Obviously, none of this stuff can really change unless there's systemic change. There's no sort of signing of documents is going to do anything really about that, and that's the unfortunate truth. These countries, these African countries, really need to get control over their own natural resources and over their own states. And this is something that the Soviet Union, like you mentioned earlier, was trying to achieve with its anti-colonial support for anti-colonial movements in Africa during the 20th century. This is one of the reasons why Russia still has a huge, a very good relationship with most of Africa, I would say, even with countries that still do business with the West. One of the things I want to make clear to people also is that at the Russia-Africa Forum, this was not like a forum of people that were saying like, down with the West, we love only Russia. It was actually, mostly African countries that were like, why can't we just do business with whoever we want? It's like the West is the one that's trying to harass African countries out of doing business with Russia. And Russia's approach is just trying to give African nations a more economically beneficial option so that they choose the Russian option. Russia's kind of trying to do this, like, Russia's trying to be the good businessman, and the West is trying to be the monopoly capitalist, essentially. And because of that relationship, I mean, obviously most of Africa is a little turned off by this old colonial style pressure they're trying to exert on the continent, I think. And going back to the Soviet period, it was different back then because it wasn't only the Soviet Russia trying to cut deals with African countries, of course, but they were trying to contribute to the liberation of the continent, the overthrow of capitalism, so that countries not only would be able to trade on equal terms with their trading partners like the Soviet Union, but also have control over the means of production and the natural resources of their own countries, so they never again fall under imperialist control. And I just want to actually show a couple posters to everyone that's watching, because I've got some here that I've downloaded. They're Soviet propaganda posters from that era. I'll translate them for you, for everyone watching. So this is one of the most popular ones, I would say. If any of you have seen Soviet propaganda posters, you've probably seen this one connected to Africa. I mean, it says "Народы Африки обуздают колонизаторов." The people of Africa are going to rein in the colonizers. This one is one of my favorites, actually. I think it's just aesthetically very cool. It says "Afrika борется, Afrika победит." Means Africa is struggling and Africa will be victorious. Here's another one coming up. This one's kind of similar to the last one, but this one says Africa is building, Africa will be victorious. Afrika строит, Afrika победит. And this last one I'm going to show is particularly important because we should really discuss this concept in general. But this one is not just about Africa, but it says Lenin Veliki nam pуть озарил. And it means that the great Lenin showed us the path, you know, and it's basically giving the message that African liberation can only be done through socialism, essentially, you know, like that's really the only way that the African nations are going to be truly liberated, because even if they are able to throw off Western imperialism, if capitalist class relations remain there, then I mean, at the end of the day, they're unfortunately going to still be part of the capitalist system. That's why, like, maybe we should talk about this as well. You know, like, multipolarity is of course a good thing, but it's unclear how it would develop. If it was victorious, you know, because we're not talking about a world system that is striving towards socialism. We're looking at a world system, a world movement that's striving for still something good, but a little bit short-sighted, I would say. The short-sightedness is in it only striving for detaching the basically transforming the dependent periphery of the capitalist world into independent, or I guess as far as independent they could be, but independent, basically capitalist countries that are weaker than the West and economically. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that also, Alex.
Well, I'll deal with the multipolarity question, because this obviously comes up quite a lot. So I agree with your characterization of the limitations there. The way I see it is that multipolarity, like the decline of the stranglehold that US imperialism and its vassals have exercised over the world for the last 30 years, the weakening of that is obviously something that we as communists must welcome.
Yeah.
And it is the primary contradiction facing the world is, of course, the US imperialist system. Mm-hmm. And it is a system that they tried to construct to be a global system in which everybody in the world would have their place within it. And this is what they mean by the rules-based international order. They mean the system that they tried to create after 1991, where every single country in the world would basically play a role as, well, mostly a provider of raw resources, as we've already said. So, like, the role that was duly assigned to Russia was to be this weak dictatorship run by a Yeltsin-type figure, or maybe somebody slightly more sober, and to provide large amounts of oil and gas into the world market. That was the only role it was supposed to play. And it was supposed to be caged in and stopped from asserting itself in any way by endless US military bases and NATO expansion. China was supposed to just play the role of the endless provider of cheap manufactured goods. It wasn't supposed to develop a high tech base of its own. It wasn't supposed to be able to challenge US supremacy on the tech basis. And Africa was meant to carry on providing agricultural resources. And ultimately, this vision that they had fell apart. And I think it fell apart quite quickly, because what is often neglected in the scholarship on the Cold War is the fact that the US won the Cold War by default. And what I mean by that is they won the Cold War because the other side, or should we say more accurately, the hierarchy on the other side, a lot of it turned openly traitorous, and the rest of it imploded, leading to the disastrous collapse of 1991. But what's neglected in that is that US capitalism itself had already been in a continual series of crises after around about 1965. And so, in actual fact, the crisis of imperialism runs a very long way. It got bailed out because of the collapse of revisionism in the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. But that didn't really solve its crisis. For all the looting and destruction that it was able to carry out in the world after 1991, it was not able to overcome that fundamental crisis of profitability that had kicked in the middle 1960s. It was also arguably an extension of a much longer crisis of imperialism that goes all the way back to the pre-World War I era. Because one of the things that Lenin analyzes, of course, in the book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is the way in which that imperialism has brought capitalism to this impasse that it can only find a way out of by monumental acts of destruction through war. And that this crisis was intensified by, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution, which helped to unleash waves of anti-colonial liberation movements in Africa and all over the world, all over the colonized world. And for all the damage that revisionism and the counter-revolutions of the 80s and 90s have done, that legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, that anti-colonial legacy, still stands strong. And the imperialists are still unable, even after everything that's gone on, to fully impose themselves in the way that they could prior to 1914. So you've got this long-lasting crisis of imperialism. The US attempts to construct a global system to reinstall their hegemony for a new century. Remember the old phrase, project for a new American century. That project has failed. It's been a bloody, disastrous failure. But now, of course, you're starting to see it fully, well, start to unravel at least. And the multipolarity stage is, I would identify it as being a stage that's the next one along, obviously, that is an evolution towards a weakened West, which ultimately will, I think, start devouring itself. And the US will devour all of its vassal states to keep itself afloat. And eventually then will have to face the dreadful reality of its own internal contradictions inside the United States. Whereas, of course, the Chinese and the Russians and India to an extent, and the African nations that are looking for different development models will start to develop differently. But as you've indicated in the question you were asking there, unless that path is a socialist path, then it's going to be limited. Because again, I'll go back to the work of Nkrumah and others who in that liberation period saw that the attempts to go down a capitalist path for the African nations was one that was ultimately going to lead to a dead end, because it would lead to them being still subject to the influences of colonialism. And of course, in Nkrumah's case, it led to him being subjected to a coup, and as it did many other African leaders. So the African masses will work out, I'm sure, very quickly that the socialist way forward is the only way they're actually going to be able to develop their country. Because, of course, they're looking at the tremendous achievements of China and the achievements of the old Soviet Union. Well, all of that has its basis in revolution. The Chinese wouldn't be able to develop in the quite astonishing way that they had the Mao period not thoroughly extirpated the remnants of feudalism and imperial control, which is what the African nations will end up having to do, because only the revolutionary proletariat in alliance with the peasantry can drive forward the wiping out of the remnants of feudalism, the wiping out of the influence of the comprador bourgeois and the structures that they've put in place. Because otherwise what you're going to get is you might get some more industrial development in the African nations. You might get some economic growth that's more positive than that which came in the past. But the class contradictions in a place like Nigeria, where you have this enormous proletariat and, of course, a peasantry as well, but you have a completely and utterly parasitic ruling class that, even if they got to be a little bit more independent, would be barely any better. And so it will lead the African proletariat into an inevitable confrontation with the decadent and corrupt capitalist classes that exist there. And what I think you will see is a strong revival of African socialism, maybe an extension of Pan-African socialism as well. And that's, again, it's a hugely positive development because it will lead, I think, to the African nations becoming centers, potential centers of global revolution now. And if you think of the inspiration that the African masses would take from like a revolution in a place like Nigeria, or shall we say if the economic freedom fighters were to come to power in a place like South Africa, the knock-on effects of that in all of these countries which are desperate for liberation would be huge. So we're seeing multipolarity must be a stage on the road to socialism for the nations that have been subject to neocolonialism, and only that can provide the development they need to take their nations forward. Because capitalism as a system its time has gone, its progressive phase is over. The only way you're going to be able to develop now by using capitalism is if you have a capitalism that is directed by a very powerful centralized state, and is where the capitalist class is basically shoved into a corner and told what to do. And if that's what you're going to have, well, you might as well go the whole way and actually institute socialism, because what a truly socialist system gives you, as we see from the examples of USSR, China, Cuba, the DPRK, and others, is, of course, it unleashes the creativity and the energy of the masses to carry out a revolutionary transformation of those societies, not just in terms of ridding themselves of the backward elements that where imperialism and feudalism have left them with, but also in terms of economic development. Because as we see from like the planned economy period in the 1930s in the USSR, you see the titanic results that were attained there. And that is because, of course, it came from the revolutionary enthusiasm and the mass participation of the Soviet workers and peasants in creating that new system, knowing that it was truly their country that they owned and that they controlled. If you think of what that could do in these resource-rich areas in the African nations, socialism could make these places into actual workers' paradises given enough time.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. Revolutionary enthusiasm could do a lot in that regard. I also wanted to go back to something else you mentioned about de-dollarization, because at the Russia-Africa summit, the head of the BRICS International Development Bank was there. I forgot her name actually, but she's the Brazilian.
Is it Dilma Rousseff?
Yeah. She was there. She met with Vladimir Putin, and one of the main things they were discussing in terms of where to go forward with expanding, the scope and influence of the multinational development bank, or the new development bank rather, for developing this multipolar world, is through obviously doing as many international transactions as possible in national currencies. Now, I think that's a good stepping stone. Just as the idea of multipolarity, like we just discussed, it's a stepping stone on the way to socialism. But what other things do you think could be done in the international economic system to basically dismantle the hegemony of the dollar, other than international transactions with national currencies?
Well, clearly that's a start, and the differing international payment systems that the Russians and the Chinese have developed over the last few years are positive, because it enables countries now to have an alternative to the US-controlled SWIFT system. And the main objective, or certainly one of the main objectives, should be the dismantling of the imperial mechanisms of control, which are, of course, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization. Because even though, of course, many nations have had to join these to do business, these are organizations which are mechanisms set up by largely the American imperialists with the assistance of the British, to be able to effectively control the economic development of nations by essentially putting them in a state of perpetual debt slavery. And those are things that really need to be demolished. I mean, if you look at how they use the the International Monetary Fund in a place like South America, where you get some stooge regime, like the former presidency in Argentina, for instance, took out, I believe it was a $4 billion IMF loan to pay off a previous bunch of loans to put the country into more debt. And this was also done by the stooge regime of Moreno in Ecuador, took out another, I believe it was also a $4 billion loan from the IMF to essentially make sure that whoever followed him, even if it was a sort of more Rafael Correaist figure, would be saddled with a gigantic amount of debt and wouldn't be able to shift it very easily, and would enable the US, via its control of the international financial system and the banking system, to exercise an awful lot of pressure on these countries. And it's not just places in Africa or places in South America that suffer from this. This is what the Europeans do to Southern European and Eastern European nations as well. I mean, let's look at what was done to Greece via the control that the European Central Bank had exercised, by the fact that, of course, it doesn't control its own currency. They enforce deflationary package after deflationary package on that country, calling for more and more cutbacks in wages and public services, condemning the Greek working class to more and more misery. And also they can give it a loan to pay off another loan and keep it in this perpetual debt cycle. So breaking out of that, breaking down that international financial machinery that enables the US imperialists to keep their stranglehold over these countries, that's going to be crucial. Because once you manage to show a way out for people, like I recall I don't know if you remember this, the debates that happened over the overthrow of the previous government in Sri Lanka, and they were all blaming Chinese debt for the reason why Sri Lanka was in a mess. And then, of course, you look at it, and it turns out it's all European and American debt that did it to them. The Chinese debt was negligible. And so, like, if you provide nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, South and Central America, a way to actually take loans that would genuinely help them develop their countries, whereas all the loans that come from the IMF, of course, are all about keeping them in perpetual debt slavery, then that's going to be a big step forward. It's not the whole game, of course, but it's going to be the next stage in this unfolding process, is the dismantling of the mechanisms of the US empire that have been in place really since the end of World War II. And of course, that'll cause the imperialist countries to have an absolute freak out, because these are vital for maintaining spheres of influence and control. But yeah, the BRICS Development Bank is going to be a big stage in challenging that position. And we can expect a lot more aggressive pushback from the US, because they know very well that if you combine more and more de-dollarization with the removal of their ability to force these bad loans on people and essentially act as a glorified international loan shark, then again, that's going to be a big blow to their ability to maintain this imperialist system. And of course, if they can't maintain that system, if they can't extract super profits from all these nations in the world that they have subjugated, then that calls into question the internal regime inside the United States, which is, of course, the thing that the people who run the system are ultimately terrified of. That they can no longer afford to even make the tiny concessions that still do exist to the domestic working class in all the imperialist countries. And at that point, then the whole thing starts to shake and could fall apart.
All right, well, Alex, it's been a fascinating discussion. Definitely some important topics we covered that are probably in the headlines of the news, even in the West, I would guess. But I just want to let all the viewers know that they should definitely check out the website of Marx Engels Lenin Institute, which we put in the chat, as well as the Telegram channel. But Alex, are there any other resources that people should look at?
Yeah, we're on Twitter as well, so check out the Twitter page on there. It consists mainly at the moment of me challenging trade union bureaucrats in Britain as to why they're funding the Labour Party. But yeah, go in the Telegram channel, check us out on Twitter and the website, and the YouTube page as well, of course, where the live streams are up.
All right, cool. Well, Alex, thanks again for coming on the show. Really interesting. We'll have to do it again. Definitely.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. that's the end for this live stream. Thanks for watching, and make sure to come on out for the next one, and workers of the world unite. All right, cool.